could better explain why we can't capture this informal sector. But what I was thinking, so it's just a remark, and it's also been inspired from the Morocco comment from yesterday about the statue of the artist, the recognition of the statue of the artist. And I really think that we have a way to maybe introduce this notion with the indicator 19 about artistic freedom, which is an indicator that actually include notes elements about the statue of the artist. Definitely first, the recognition of the statue of the artist is the best way to encourage people to get into the formalized sector. So maybe this indicator could be also a way to advocate policies to better recognize the artist, to better protect the artist, and that would encourage people to not be only a second job or within the informal sector. That could also offer the opportunity to be more to be captured in further research in the formal sector. So that was just a comment that I mean, just some upcoming thought about how to read across indicator on employment and with this indicator on freedom of artistic. So it's a new way to maybe cross reading to read across the indicators. And I completely agree with what said Alma and definitely Valentina. The fact that we need cross analysis, that we have to develop maybe some guidelines, and I'm sure we have identified all in our way some paths to strengthen the transversal analysis and to draft some lesson from good practices. That was it.
Thank you very much, Naima. I'm going to ask Latifa, and that would be the last one, and then we move to the peace building indicators. I just wanted to I wanted to just see if there was a question in the comments. I see that I think it's someone has commented that some indicators are redundant. Can we make it easier? Absolutely. Please give your suggestions here. That's why we have the whiteboard, so we can reflect on these suggestions. So please go ahead and write which indicators you think were redundant. Thank you very much. Over to you, Latifa.
Thank you, Jyoti. I just had a general comment to give on the qualitative indicators because we had discussed this internally at length at UNESCO and also with the experts. So we had observed with the implementation teams, even also the experts, facing challenges in the drafting of the analysis for these indicators. And we also ourselves faced challenges in attempting to visualize the results for the checklist. And the challenge really goes back to the methodology of these indicators. Checklists are not by definition indicators. So the refinement of the methodology would necessarily have to consider maybe the development of guidelines to help with the interpretation of the results, and possibly the development of a methodology to index the results so that the result can be quantified or benchmarked. So it would be very interesting to hear the take of the implementation teams on this. We hadn't really discussed with the implementation teams, so it would be nice to hear on this.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think now we will be running really very late, so I would like to leave those comments in the air, if that's okay, Latifa, and then move to discussing, and then maybe if there are further comments, people can also write to us. We would welcome your comments in writing, and certainly, you know, these 4 categories, we will put them on the platform that we have for the experts. So please, you know, see if there's a way that you can, or we send it by email, and we would be happy to have your feedback. Okay, we now want to move to discussing the peace building indicators that we had discussed in June of last year, and we really are very grateful to the work of Ellie Harrowell and William Logan, on William Logan, who worked a lot to prepare a paper and give us a lot to think about. So I want to first invite Ellie we're very delighted to have you with us. William Logan, unfortunately, is not able to work with us anymore. He's retired and he's asked to be excused from any further work on he said he really wants to move to other things, which I completely understand, as he has given us and contributed enormously. So with many thanks to William Logan, I would like now to be able to hear from Ellie the key thoughts that you brought us with the work that you and William did on the peace building indicators, and then hear from Simon more concretely on the linkages that you see, Simon, with the existing framework and where that takes us. Over to you, Ellie.
Thanks, Jyoti. I think that's a well-deserved retirement for William, for sure, so we can't begrudge him that. I'll just try and share my screen so I can put up some very simple slides. I hope you can all see that. Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so thanks so much for the opportunity to come and speak with everyone again. It feels like quite a long time since I last looked at this particular project, so it's nice to dive back in. I'm not going to talk for long today. I thought what I'd just do is give you an idea of the process that William and myself went through when we were looking at this question and seeking to develop ideas and suggestions about what kind of indicators and measures might be useful when thinking about culture's contribution to peace and to building peace. So yeah, I'll run through the process and then I'll give you an idea of where we thought things might slot in to the framework that you have already, and where we thought there might be room for additional indicators. I think when we spoke last time, when I spoke to quite a few of the people I see on here today last year, we were at this first point in the process. We were going through a pretty in-depth review of the academic research, the institutional literature, kind of the grey and policy literature, looking at this question of, well, how can we quantify the way that culture contributes to peace, and also how do we measure that? And that was really the key question we were trying to get to with this goal that I think everyone shares here of making the case for culture, making the argument for culture. We also spent some time reviewing existing peace indicators, because there are a bunch of ideas around there already about how we measure peace and how we measure peace and how that is created. But we took a decision not to just try to repurpose one of these existing models and bring it over into the cultural sector. And that was mainly for two reasons. One is that in a lot of models for trying to measure peace and think about peace, culture has traditionally been somewhat overlooked. I think more recently we're beginning to see a greater attention paid within the sphere of peace building to the role of culture and the role of heritage, and that's really good. And I think that only gets advanced by these kind of interactions across sectors. But largely in the models for measuring peace, and particularly those that look at the more negative side of peace, so that measure peace by counting violence, basically, culture doesn't play that big a part. And secondly, because a lot of these models, even when they are kind of looking more broadly and creatively at how do we measure peace, they sometimes reflect a very particular kind of worldview or philosophy about what peace should look like. And we didn't really want to reproduce that ideology within our recommendations. We wanted to do something that was more grounded in an evidence base about what's been done so far. So for example, the positive peace indicators is a model for measuring peace, but that is very much grounded in what we'd see as kind of liberal peace theory, and has a lot of assumptions around the fact that peace should be made through kind of reproducing a Western model of democracy and capitalism and so on. So we wanted to steer away from that and instead develop our suggestions for indicators very much from the academic and policy and institutional literature on what's been tried so far and what's been proven to work. So we decided to try and develop these indicators from the bottom up. And we also tried to keep in mind the work that had already been done on the Culture 2030 Indicators framework. We were very clear that this is a huge amount of work has already gone into creating this framework. And we wanted to try and make sure what we proposed could fit with that rather than reinventing the wheel. And so with that in mind, what we tried to do is two things. One, see what is already being done within the Culture 2030 framework that could also actually possibly be used to understand how culture is contributing to peace. So what data is already being collected that we could highlight as being kind of repurposed perhaps? And where did we think maybe some extra measures, some extra indicators or ideas might actually help plug some gaps somewhere? Some of these points we kind of touched on last time, but just to quickly recap, that large-scale review of literature highlighted a few things. Firstly, it makes the case for thinking about culture with peace. Culture has a unique contribution to building peace at a variety of levels. It helps us to move beyond thinking about peace just as an absence of all-out war, but in terms of societal peace, sustainable, equitable ways of living well together at local, national and international levels. And this also is useful, I think, in this kind of exercise, because it means we're not just talking about how can culture contribute to not having war between two countries, but it talks about how can culture contribute towards having peaceful existence within cities, within regions, within all different levels. And I think that's a very powerful argument for why we should be thinking about culture and its contribution to peace and the way it helps us to build and sustain peace. One of the, I think, interesting things that also links with that that really came out strongly from our review was this idea that culture can play a role at all stages of a kind of peace conflict life cycle. So culture can help prevent conflicts. It can help mitigate the impacts of conflicts when you're living in a situation of violence or conflict. It can help us to think creatively about how do we resolve conflicts, how do we move past this. And it can play a really important role in recovering from conflict, whether that is through mitigating trauma or whether rebuilding relationships that have been damaged. So culture has this kind of full life cycle set of impacts that makes it a really kind of interesting and exciting thing to try and measure. We quickly, I think this is just about where we got to when we spoke last. So through this review, we identified these kind of 8 domains where we feel that there is proof to show that culture can play a role in building and sustaining peace. So very quickly, that's through inclusivity, engagement, inclusivity, participation. It's through livelihoods, creating a positive contribution to sustainable livelihoods, dealing with the past, dealing with trauma and transitional justice, enabling dialogues and promoting empathy and seeing, humanizing the other, supporting agency and voice and speaking up in a non-violent way, protest and so on. Culture has historically had a really, really important role in that kind of area. Culture can help you develop skills, conflict management skills, traditional mechanisms for dealing with conflict, for example. It has an international and regional role to play as well. And how do we see our neighbours? How do we get on with our neighbours? How do we build bridges with our neighbours, for example? And finally, giving this kind of idea of future. Culture helps us to envisage a future for our children, for our families, and this idea of kind of protecting something and there being a future worth working together for. So we identified these 8 kind of key areas where really we felt that the proof and the research supported the idea that culture does make a tangible contribution towards building peace at various levels. And the next step we decided to approach is, before I get to that, a few caveats, of course, came from that review as well. Firstly, and I think this is really the most important, one of the most challenging things for how do we measure the impact of culture for peace, is that culture is an ambivalent force. And so it contributes to peace, but it can also be a driver of conflict. And we see so many times that culture can be instrumentalized as a way of fomenting conflict, of normalizing divisions and so on. And this really poses a big challenge for us when we come to think about how do we measure the impact of culture for peace, because it's not enough just to say certain activities are happening. We have to try and work out the direction of that. Are the cultural activities that maybe we're measuring actually promoting peace? Or could it be that that great investment in film is actually being used to create films that normalize the marginalization of a group in society, and then that actually is undermining peace? So we have to be careful about the direction that culture is pushing. We have to think carefully about how do we measure that. This links to the second point, that the role of culture can be kind of generalized. There's a bit of an idealistic tendency sometimes to say that, we will all come together around a cultural event and that will make us all great friends and very happy, and we'll all live happily ever after. We need to think quite carefully about that assumption and think about how do we work out whether policies are really bringing about the impact that we think and hope they are. And the final kind of the criticism with a lot of the literature, and I think it's somewhat getting addressed now, is that quite often initiatives that look at how can culture support peace have been not necessarily linked into a strategic long-term framework. This is getting a bit better, I think, but the question is, for me, are we sure that the relevant kind of data is being captured that allows us to measure the impact of that? I mean, that's the next kind of the trailing part of that improvement. So once we had identified those 8 areas that we think culture does make a positive impact on peace, we tried to map them across to the dimensions within the Culture 2030 framework to see, where might this actually be of relevance. And I think perhaps the first surprise was actually we mapped all of those domains over. We really felt that there wasn't a dimension of the framework that didn't have a potential to tell us something about peace, and there wasn't an area of the peace building domains that didn't sit on here. So it seems like a very good fit, and there's a kind of broad area that we can look at in terms of entry points within the framework that can tell us something about peace. My kind of personal feeling looking at this is that in particular this area of inclusion and participation is really somewhere that there's a particularly good fit. There's quite a few of the indicators underneath there that seem to have kind of a natural fit with the literature on peace building, and also kind of some of the governance and education stuff, but we'll come to that in a little second. What we did then was try and identify, firstly, what's already being done in these indicators and in the framework that we could capture as part of a way of understanding the indication on peace. Because there was a question at the start, I think Jyoti put to us, would this be a cross-cutting theme or a new set of indicators in its own right? So we first of all tried to see how would it work as a cross-cutting theme. And we identified a number of indicators that we thought could actually tell us something useful about peace, and a number of checklist items too. So public space for culture, does everyone have equal access to public space? Is that acting as a way of bringing people together and therefore creating better social cohesion and better mutual understanding? Questions around cultural employment, because of this idea that better livelihoods means fewer conflicts. And so if culture is actually supporting people and having dignified livelihoods, then that actually could be a good way of promoting peace. Education, so for sustainable development and multilingual education, there's a long-standing relationship between peace and education, and so that kind of makes a lot of sense to us. And as I said, everything around social cohesion is, to me, a kind of something of a given, that those indicators really help us to understand how culture is contributing to building peace. And also there was a number of checklist items we thought would be also useful in building this case. So around management, governance, particularly participatory and inclusive governance, so proving women are involved in governance, minority or marginalized groups are involved in governance. Cultural knowledge, artistic freedom. Artistic freedom links back to this idea of culture as voice and agency and non-violent protest and the ability to speak up. And again, participatory processes. It's really quite a key element. And then we had some suggestions in other areas where we felt maybe new indicators might be helpful in kind of making this case. So around the sustainable management of heritage, who's involved in that management? Is the management of heritage sites being done in a way that takes into account conflict dynamics, that brings different people, different groups together, either within a country or across borders? Climate adaptation and resilience, for example, suggesting that plans that look at climate adaptation and resilience should also have a conflict analysis integrated within them. Governance of culture, again, things around inclusive governance, participatory governance, and education, cultural knowledge, and again, these kind of social cohesion, access to culture, everything that sits underneath that inclusion and participation we felt could be even further strengthened to make the case for culture's contribution to building peace at kind of local, national, international levels. I will stop there because I don't want to keep talking, and I know that Simon had some useful thoughts to share around operationalizing some of these indicators and the practicalities of it. But really open to everyone's feedback. This was kind of an initial first pass at trying to think about, well, how can we build upon what's already been done in terms of making these kind of indicators that make this case that I think is a really important and only becomes more and more important case to make around the way that culture can impact on building peace. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ellie. That was really very, very quick overview of the very in-depth work that you and William did, and we're very grateful to you for those for that work. I want to, before opening up for any discussion, I would like to move now to Simon to talk a little bit more in depth about the methodology that we could use, or different ways to think about the indicators. I see, Naima, that your hand is up. Naima Labil, did you want to ask a question right now, or could we wait until we are in the discussion? Okay, I think we could probably wait. So let's go with Simon.
Thank you, Jyoti. So my job is really to look now at the the implementation of the indicators and the existing relationship to the existing framework. So I'm just going to say, so to start with, I think it's really important to go back to the foundation of UNESCO in 1945, and this is the quote directly from the Constitution as to why UNESCO was formed. And I think it's nice because it explains everything that UNESCO does, really, and why be involved in education, why be involved in culture, science, communications. It's all about this sense of getting the minds of men to understand each other. I see on one part of the UNESCO site, it's been changed to the minds of men and women. But I think that's wrong. I think it is really the minds of men we're talking about here who create the conflicts. So to start with, I think we should really look again at the process. Why are the indicators there? What are we doing when we're constructing indicators? So why are we collecting peace? Are we looking to say that these processes will make a country more peaceful? Are we saying that this country is peaceful? Ellie raised this question of time frame. Are we looking about things which are going to point to an improved situation? And then we're talking about national policy and then activities. Those are the two kinds of issues that we take. The national policies we identify, and institutional structures we identify in the checklists, and activities we tend to count them or look at statistics. And we need indicators that capture this. But then there's a few questions that come in on methodology as well. Distortion. How much will we only capture things which are in Culture 2030? And will this really capture all the aspects, or only a strange view of how culture contributes to peace? And then how is that interpreted? The relevance. So Ellie is the expert on it. I'm learning more about it, but listen to Ellie, don't listen to me. But we know that in all the questions of indicators, something irrelevant for one country may not be for another. And it's in some of the peace literature, they very much talk about the peace looks different in one country to another, and therefore different structures, different discussions are happening. Then the other thing is about directionality. This applies to all indicators. And this is, again, the point that Naima Labil raised about yeses and nos. Is a yes to a answer, is it really a sense that it's going in the right direction? And some things which seem to be going in the right direction, especially around culture, can be provoking more or less peace. And again, I'll come back to that one. So I think the key issue on every item in the checklist, on every indicator that's coming up, is will a positive answer to this question, with evidence, because that's really important, to suggest that peace is more likely or more sustainable. And that, I think, is what one has to ask oneself for every item we think of introducing and every existing item that we think may apply. The other thing, we're talking to friends of mine who are involved in peace, neighbours, in fact, we came up with two key words here: the fires and the glue. With fires, the fires are there, burning, simmering away, but the fires must be out. UNESCO is not about creating peace, about stepping in conflicts. It's really post-conflict, I think. Then the glue is this sense of, in post-conflict, you're trying to bring people together, make things stick together. And we know that some glues work and some glues won't, and some glues fall apart in different ways. So where can we look at things which lead to significant positive change? And that links to this idea of positive versus negative senses of peace. I think above all, culture is about making things better, more peaceful, and pointing in that positive direction. Culture can resolve the conflicts, or help resolve conflicts, help bring people together, but I think substantially it's more on that positive side. And then national policy, the global and the national versus the local. So how much is it the peace treaty that creates the peace? How much is it local communities? And that poses a problem for us in terms of the indicators, because even when we're talking about urban levels, we're talking about activities which we're kind of seeing from a distance. We still need to look at whether those communities are coming together, and whether the national policy will make a difference, and how does that actually work. So what kind of evidence are we talking about here, and how would that be presented in terms of compiling the indicators? So I think that's probably that one. Let me go forward. So again, this aligns with some of the things that Ellie was saying, and again, some of the things that have been talked about. So there's been some talk about public spending on heritage in relation to military spending. I think there are technical issues about double counting, and we've seen already the issues about spending in various ways. And again, I would ask, does that make a difference? If you spend more on heritage and less on military, does that mean that conflict is less likely, or that things are more peaceful? What does that look like? On 18, on social cohesion, as Ali said, I think we're in very solid ground here. Clearly, 18 directly measures whether people are coming together or not, and what happens. Under education, I'm not sure, but there's something in there, but I don't know where it is, as it were. So, for example, for Education for Sustainable Development, for 13, we have to be very clear there. This is a globally adopted official SDG indicator, which is collected by the education sector. So I'm not sure how much we can change the methodology, and I think we must deduct from what's there already. And then when we talk about multilingualism, we're talking about hours of instruction in different languages, and it's a statistical indicator. So I'm not sure, again, how much we can adapt that to get a substantive answer. but perhaps on the checklist, I think it's 14, and perhaps on 17, where I talked already about TVET and higher or secondary education, at that level, we may be able to talk about something about what's in the curriculum, but what kind of activities are those? How do we collect the evidence? How do we set that out in the kind of things we're talking about now in the reports on the culture profile? Something that's kind of missing, but I think is essential, is the role of women. Gender is really important here to this horizontal scrap through all indicators. And we know that women are key in peace building, from the women in Argentina that disappeared, to the Northern Ireland process, to peace huts in Liberia, where I've worked in detail as well. So we need to see what that gender dimension is and what that looks like, again, in indicators in what we collect. And then I have a problem with heritage. So we can think of lots of heritage sites that have contested values. The most obvious one is Jerusalem, but I have put in lots of possible questions of conflict there. One person's heritage is another person's oppression sometimes. So interpreting the directionality again of this is extremely difficult. And again, I do have some concerns about how that would happen. And then lastly, many countries actually use big cultural events to say that everything's going very well and we're back to normal when they're not. So again, we have a question of interpretation here. What does an event, a thing which is cultural, which seems to be promoting peace, is that real? How far is it a real indicator? I mean, how do we put this all together? As we said many times before, if we get lots of yeses, does that mean that a country is more peaceful? Again, it may be that one core decision in one country has much bigger impact, but a whole lot of little measures of peace building in another country. So again, that sense of balance between values, let's say, is important. Now, I know Ellie has said this is a problematic index, and I completely accept that, and she knows and I don't. So, but I think one of the things that I do think is maybe we take Ellie's model, but I think a model of peace would help in the sense of we're not going to measure all of peace building. What we're measuring is culture. And so to see culture's part in peace building, we have to see what the other part is, because that's that leverage. And in a way, we're doing the same with the SDGs. We're saying, what is culture's part in the SDGs? How does it contribute to a bigger global picture? So what is the bigger global picture here, and what does that look like, so that we can see that sense of how culture fits in? Lots of questions, no answers, I'm afraid. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for having raised those very, very crucial and important questions. Okay, I'm going to invite everyone back to another whiteboard, this time for us to really work together to see how we can make sense of what Ellie and Simon have given us in their short overview, and also the materials that you received before the meeting, to reflect on ways that we could make this possible. So we could look at refining the existing data points, indicators, in terms of how we word them, or how those specific data points are collected. Or we could look at adding new data points or new indicators, same as what we had said to Ellie a while back, except now I think we have advanced a bit to reflect on it a lot more, and with the inputs that Simon and Ellie have both provided us. So please feel free to write as we speak, and please feel free to raise your hand. The floor is open for discussion. So I see let me bring up the list of, yes, Naima, please, Naima Labil, and then Alma. Yes, go ahead, please. Naima.
Merci, Jyoti. Je vais intervenir sur deux axes. Alors, le premier, c'est tout à l'heure, Ellie a parlé de la question de la paix comme un meilleur manquant. Il y a peut-être aussi un élément dont on n'a pas parlé, qui est la temporalité de la culture. La culture agit sur le temps long. Et c'est un élément un peu complexe quand on fait un plaidoyer auprès des politiques et des décideurs. Je vais prendre un exemple. Il y a plusieurs études qui montrent que le livre et la lecture est un élément qui incontestablement développe l'empathie. Or, l'empathie est un facteur majeur dans un maillon majeur de la question de la paix. Mais c'est quelque chose qui se passe sur un temps très long, sur tout un système éducatif. Donc, comment arriver à introduire ces données, qui est que le soutien et l'investissement, par exemple, par rapport au livre, qui est un secteur qui est souvent déficitaire, est un secteur qui, en termes de cohésion et de lien, et donc en termes d'éléments de possibilité de la paix, est un élément majeur. C'est une question extrêmement importante parce que en introduisant cette temporalité, ça nous permettrait d'éviter d'être ce que Ellie appelait des bisounours, c'est-à-dire on sait bien qu'il ne suffit pas de faire lire un livre à un gamin pour qu'il soit quelqu'un de plutôt versé vers la paix ou plutôt vers le combat, mais c'est quelque chose sur le temps long. Voilà. Donc ça, c'est le premier élément. Le deuxième élément, c'est une question que je voudrais poser à Ellie et à Simon sur pourquoi ne pas introduire dans les indicateurs relatifs à la paix, l'indicateur numéro 6 et le numéro 9. Et là, je vais revenir encore à l'exemple du Maroc, parce que quand on a travaillé, et Simon a beaucoup contribué à cela, on s'est rendu compte que entre le processus de la production et la consommation culturelle, il y avait comme une espèce de cercle vertueux entre la production des biens et des services culturels et la consommation des biens et des services culturels. Et que ce cercle vertueux n'était pas simplement un cercle vertueux de type économique, mais qu'il avait une dimension beaucoup plus large que je vais exprimer dans les termes suivants et que je ressens beaucoup, moi, au Maroc, et que beaucoup de gens me reflètent, qui est le sentiment d'être très fier parce qu'il y a un modèle de consommation, un modèle d'habiter, une manière de s'habiller qui est à la fois occidentale, mais aussi profondément marocaine. Et donc, il y a un sentiment de fierté de développer quelque chose d'alternatif au rouleau compresseur de l'homogénéisation des modèles occidentaux. Et je pense qu'il y a certainement quelque chose à creuser.
I do believe we could dig a little bit further into this feeling and the sharing of model of consumption, if I can call it, to the Moroccan consumption model, and this peace feeling, deep peace feeling. And I do believe there are things that we should look into, and we would find quite interesting results. Could we not consider indicators 6 and 9 and link them to the peace element and introduce the element of time? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This is a very deep philosophical point that you raised, Naima. Thank you very much for it. Alma, please go ahead.
efforts to include these two as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alma. These are very concrete suggestions. Simon, please go ahead.
Thank you. After Ellie should definitely talk. For Naima, I think there's something there in what you say about the Moroccan model. And I can see there's something there also about sustainable lifestyles in many countries. I have some difficulty with the economic indicators. Just to take a kind of a critical point of view, let's say. My real question here is, if jobs are created, does job creation in itself, or people working in a certain area, does that make peace more likely? And I'm not sure about that. We know that conflict is often located in a large group of disaffected youth, let's say. And so I think, again, both the issues around, to bring in Alma's point about 16 and 17, secondary school and training and global citizenship, I think that is where the kind of things we would like to do this. But I think we need careful thought about what those activities will be, both on the economic side and the education side, and how to really capture that in a situation as well where countries are spending a lot of time pulling together an enormous amount of data. So I'll stop there and hand over to others.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. Ellie, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for these really interesting and helpful comments and suggestions. I think to take your first point, Naima, this question of temporality is really interesting. And I think generally the way that within peace building, people try and deal with that idea of, how do you capture that kind of temporality is often through education. And so it would be kind of looking at how are we equipping our future generations through education with the types of skills that are that contribute to building peace, like critical thinking and conflict management skills and empathy, as you say. So I think that is probably why, personally, I think education is particularly important in this. And then that links, Alma, to your point. I'm very open to all of you people who know better what precisely is meant in each of those indicators, to point to where actually what would be the most appropriate of the indicators under education that would help us to understand that relationship with peace. Because I think it's important, that really is one of the greatest areas that culture makes contribution to peace. Working out how we best capture that through the data is kind of the bigger challenge, the one that you guys are better placed actually than I to speak to. Naima, just also to that point about this kind of virtuous circle within the cultural industry in Morocco, I think that's really interesting and really positive, and certainly is kind of a large scale pattern within peace and conflict. We know that more people have more and better jobs and a kind of more dignified ability to look after themselves and their families, the less likely conflict is, and kind of a large scale idea. The problem would be, I think, with including that as an indicator, as something we're trying to measure that's applicable to all cases, is what happens when the opposite is happening, when you have a lot of people engaging in a local cultural economy that is predicated on a kind of exclusionary ideal. So instead of kind of promoting kind of a solidarity and pride and so on, you have a kind of an unvirtuous circle where you have an economy that is actually excluding large sectors of society or creating other such problems. So it comes back, I think, a little bit to this problem of, number one, having indicators that could work across a number of cases in roughly the same way, and trying to understand that directionality. Like in this case, that cultural circular economy might be promoting a really kind of positive ideal, but in another case, it might be doing something quite different. And how we make that distinction is really the challenge, I think.
Thank you, Ellie. I see that Naima, Labil, and Simon, you still have your hands up. I don't know if you're looking for the floor or if these are old hands. Okay, thank you. Naima, Labil, I don't know if your hand is an old hand or a new hand. Okay, I'm going to give the floor to Valentina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting exchange. So I wanted to raise one point linked to what Simon was saying. Of course, one of the challenges is to how to measure not only the degree of engagement of countries, for instance, to support peace building through culture, but also measure impacts. As Simon was correctly saying, the fact that these countries are engaged does not say that this has necessarily an impact on peace building. But of course, this is a difficult issue to be solved. On the other end, I think that even if we will be able to set up and to build a database with a number of policy measures and initiatives that have been undertaken to try to support peace building through culture, it would already be a very good starting point to try to measure impacts on peace building over time. So also to take the temporality aspect. And for the short term, perhaps as a proxy of peace building, of course, we could take the tolerance indicators and do some cross analysis between the policy measures on the one hand and the tolerance indicators on the other. So this was one comment, and then I had a question whether in the review that you did of the literature, whether you did encounter or you did search for any empirical studies that try to measure the impact of culture on peace building, and if so, what are the results, what are the main findings and the indicators used? Thank you.
Many thanks, Valentina. I'm going to move now to BBP Hosmio from the Philippines, and then we'll come back to Simon and Naima to respond to some of the points raised. I'm sorry, Simon and Ellie to respond to some of the points raised. Please go ahead, Hosmio.
Thanks, Dr. Jyoti. This question is addressed to everybody, but maybe more particularly to Ellie and Dr. Simon. I suppose in thinking about development of peace building indicators, we wish to see a world that's less fragmented and a world where we can live harmoniously with each other. But it's also true, and I think that is the reality in so many societies, that exclusion is a fundamental component in maintaining a sort of harmonious life. When I say exclusion, of course, I mean keeping some groups at the margins, rendering them invisible. And that's just the reality. Just like Dr. Simon rightfully said in regards to heritage, that a heritage to one may be the beginning of trauma to another. So I'm just thinking in the international sense of peace, because of course we might have to just say that, well, that is the idea of peace for one community or for one society, and that this is another sort of version of peace for another. But then I'm thinking in the international sense of peace building, if we reach that kind of scenario, might peace look like very ambivalent? How do you address that? Thank you. Jyoti again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm since I have the floor and I don't see any other hands at the moment, I want to take a minute to reflect on a couple of things. I think that this point about exclusion and the point that Naima Labil said earlier about pride, I think are quite connected, because what I'm thinking is that there is a way by which people are able to the self-determination of people's identities and the recognition of those identities is, I think, very fundamental to peace, where there isn't a sense of either somebody else defining identities or of the